Thank you very much for all the questions and comments to the You and Your Profile book launch, which we posted a while ago. And today we're doing the promised Q&A, and I'll try to address as many questions and criticisms as I can. One issue that was brought up by a few viewers was what could be called the fakeness of profilicity, that is profile-based identity, which is the main topic of the You and Your Profile book. Benjamin Feiner, for instance, writes, would you say that right now in the internet culture we live in, we are all just playing a game of make-believe in that we pretend to be fictional characters in a fictional space that is only arbitrarily connected to the real world? And somewhat similarly, Stephen Dedalus says, from things like the popularity of Photoshop to the purchasing of fake followers and reviews, it seems to me that profilicity as a paradigm is an inherently unreliable basis of social relations. Well, the basic idea, one of the basic ideas of the book is that no matter which identity technology we use, and we must use one, identity is always an effect of performance. This idea is not new. For instance, the famous sociologist Erving Goffman wrote a book in the 1950s on the presentation of self, and he used the metaphorics of theater play in order how to describe how people produce identity in a kind of stage-like manner. Now, we basically agree with Goffman on this, and we think that all identities are performed. There are just different ways of performing. Now, we introduce, and I'll talk about this in a minute as well, the notion of genuine pretending in order to point out that somewhat paradoxically, this performance creates genuineness. So it doesn't violate genuineness, because genuineness is not something that is pre-existing, but it is paradoxically the effect of a performance. Now, looking at profilicity, the fakeness is maybe even more obvious than in sincerity or in authenticity, where somehow in sincerity it is taken for granted that the role that you play is somehow, for instance, a natural gender role. And of course, in authenticity, there is the idea that the self that you present is somehow an accurate reflection of or representation of your true self. In both cases, this is problematic, and somehow, to use a phrase that was once coined by a journalist about Trump, in profilicity, there is some sort of weird honesty. People who are profilic are, and this is the phrase, weirdly honest liars, in the sense that their staging a persona becomes very obvious. And I think that's clear if you look at the photo that we use to illustrate profilicity, the people jumping simultaneously at a beach. This is communicated as staged. Everyone knows that it is staged. So in this sense, there is even some form of paradoxical honesty to staged profilicity. Nevertheless, and this has to be highlighted, also in profilicity, you shouldn't lie. As we say, you should be somehow invested in your profile and follow up on it. So you shouldn't just blatantly present you as something that is in contradiction to whatever your real intentions or your real opinions or what you really do and so forth. The CV is always staged and manufactured, but it shouldn't contain clearly fake, misleading information. So a performance and fakeness is not necessarily the same, or actually it is not the same. And similarly, that something is clearly staged or performant is not the same as something being clearly fake or a lie. Then there were a few questions about profilicity and capitalism. Roth-Schwarz, for instance, writes, how do you see profilicity within capitalism? And Eric Desrosiers says, in your example about the Airbnb superhost, what wasn't clear to me is how do you differentiate between someone who doesn't want to lose their superhost status for business reasons and another for profile reasons? Well, good questions. I think there is a very close connection between capitalism and prophylicity, which is obvious because we live in a capitalist environment. Somehow everything is related to capitalism. And so the two things cannot really be separated in many instances, just as is the case with the Airbnb profile. So business and profile interests are often very closely related, and we actually got a word for this. This is the word brand. Right? The concept of brand explains precisely this close connection between identity and the commodification of this very identity. So, and derived from this, we also have this notion of personal branding. So, prophylicity, of course, is closely related to something like, or is a form of personal branding. It's just a wider concept. And profile value, therefore, has at the same time identity and economic value. It does commodify identity. 16215 said the definitions of prophylicity and sincerity seem the most similar. Yes, this is correct, a good observation. For instance, they are both inauthentic from the perspective of authenticity because of their outside orientation. The outside, the role or the profile, is that which is the most real and not the inside, not the inner self. And yet there are also clear differences between sincerity and prophylicity. Henry Rosemont, in his book Against Individualism, basically described what we call sincerity with the image of an onion. Namely that a person is somehow, a personhood is built up like an onion with the different layers of the onion representing the different roles that one has. For instance, different family roles in sincerity, like father and brother and son and uncle and so forth. And all these different roles, like in an onion, are somehow organically related and form a coherent whole. And that is decidedly not the case in prophylicity, where these different profiles that you have in completely different social settings have no coherence. They don't match up. They don't build one organic whole. Secondly, in traditional role-based, sincerity-based society, there is a relatively strong stability of the roles. They're often roles that you have for a whole lifetime. Like, again, you're a son for all of your life, basically. As opposed to this, in prophylicity, profiles are highly unstable. They don't last forever. They have to be constantly updated. A profile that is old is no longer valid. So that's a decisive difference. And a third difference is that typically in sincerity, the role is presented to your peers, and these peers are present. The family members, for instance, or the members of whatever a military unit which in you live. These are present peers, and you have to have your identity confirmed by them. In prophylicity, however, what is very important is the peer who is not present, right? You project your identity to an often very large audience of people you do not know and you cannot know and you don't even want to know, right? For instance, on social media or if you have a business, then the profile that is built is really directed to a large, wide audience, and those who you do not have direct personal relationships often count more than those with whom you have relationships. Then there were some questions on an issue which I find very important, the issue of identity and causes, or more specifically, identity and political causes. Watcher said, I didn't get in what way your position is in disagreement with Stirner there, referring to the German philosopher Max Stirner and his book, The Ego and Its Own. Now, Max Stirner was what we could maybe call an authenticity extremist. He wrote in the mid-19th century, and he basically stipulated that you should have no cause other than yourself. Any cause you have and that you dedicate yourself to already takes away from your authenticity. It makes you somehow inauthentic if you replace your concern for yourself with your concern for something other than yourself. So Stirner was implying that something like a pure authenticity is ideal and can exist. But Actually, I think that is really not the case. When we are highly invested in a cause, at the same time, we thereby build our identity. So we build a sense of self by taking up a cause. The cause and the self mutually support one another. And I don't think you can have one without the other. And then Warhammer 2013 says, could you explain in more detail what you mean when you say identification with the cause? Thereby, I mean exactly the same thing. We build a stronger sense of self by identifying with a cause, for instance, a religious cause, a political cause. If, for instance, you identify with the fight against climate change, then you're not only doing something political, but you're also shaping your own selfhood. Again, I think Stirner is wrong by saying that identification is possible, so to speak, without any cause. Even if you have authenticity as your cause, then authenticity is a cause. It is already some form of objectified subjectivity. There is no such thing as pure subjectivity. Subjectivity and objectivity, and that's an idea you can actually find already in Hegel, kind of mutually enhance one another. And they cannot really be abstracted from one another, which is what Stirner tries to do. Therefore, the identification with a cause is substantial not only for the objective cause, you couldn't have a cause without people identifying with it, but also for the subjective side of it. You can't really build up identity without any cause. One viewer actually expressed this very well, I think. Tom Burns says, many things external to us supply personal identity or parts thereof. Those things may be other persons or relationships or geography, but they may also be religious or political movements like wokeism. And when a part of our personal identity is attacked, it can feel like we, the person identified, are attacked. KW speaks about the same issue, writing, given that many topics of great relevance for society, global warming, social and economic equality, and so forth, are strongly linked with identity, that would imply that rational discourse about these topics is no longer possible, since people cannot be convinced by rational arguments to change their identity. Well, sort of, but maybe we should replace rational here with objective, right? The point is that there is necessarily a strongly subjective aspect to taking up any cause. That doesn't necessarily make taking up such causes irrational, but again, it makes it necessarily subjective while being objective at the same time. So it is impossible to have a discourse that is merely objective, and I think it's important, which is often not really done, to acknowledge the necessary subjective aspect of it. The same issue, subjectivity and objectivity, also informs two concrete examples we discuss in the book. The first one is about the so-called ClimateGate, where climate scientists were accused to lie about climate change, but then it was found out they didn't lie. And a friend of us then was relieved. So we argue in the book this is somehow paradoxical, because in this way she actually expressed her relief unintentionally that the climate is actually warming up. And somewhat similar, we argued in the case of the actor and activist Jussie Smollett, who allegedly faked a hate crime against himself. In this case, a colleague again said, oh, I'm so sad he lied about these things, which again unintentionally means that she thereby implied that it would have somehow been better if the crime had actually taken place. Now, people criticized our interpretation of this, saying, oh, there are actually other reasons. In both cases, the person wasn't really happy that climate change is taking place, nor was the other person really happy that the hate crime didn't take place. Amber S., for instance, says, there is an ontological security I feel when I believe my narratives and information sources are trustworthy. So Amber says these people were just happy that they hadn't been duped, either by clientists or in the other case where they're unhappy that they had been duped. And then Ari Lev says, and others said the same thing, that they were unhappy with Jussie Smollett or they were happy that the climate scientists didn't lie because for strategical reasons, right? It would have been incredibly bad publicity for instance, social justice causes, or it was bad publicity for social justice causes that Smollett lied, and it would have been very bad publicity for ecological causes if the climate scientists had lied. And all these criticisms are correct. Both trustworthiness point is correct as the strategical point, and we're not trying to deny this at all. We just wanted to point out on, let's say, the other side of this happiness of climate change data being correct, for instance. And Amber S. expresses the same thing very well. She says, I find there's certainly a degree of happiness when my side is right, even if what we're right about is a tragic truth. And someone else says that, sure, as an ecologist, you'd feel like somehow a fool if it turns out that global warming isn't taking place. So there is a paradox here. And this paradox is something that cannot be avoided. It's nothing bad, but it's also something that, that's the whole idea of prophelicity, to point to such paradoxes. Identification with a cause does not only mean that the cause is at stake, but also that one's identity is at stake. And this is what explains this certain degree of happiness when my side is right, even if you are right about a tragic truth. Now, this paradox that you're happy about something that you are against is actually existing, this paradoxical happiness has to do with the unavoidable intertwining of the subjective and the objective. This, again, is nothing bad, nor is it something that can be avoided, but it should also not be explained away. An unselfish identification with a cause is impossible. A certain selfishness is central to how we embrace causes. Some viewers were critical about what we said regarding Airbnb and also the Chinese social credit system. I'm just quoting here one of the most constructive remarks by Dems42Blob. I still struggle with the bridge between the Chinese social credit system and the Airbnb example. Could you try to put more emphasis on the attributes or features over which such a comparison is made? I want to believe that the sole purpose of this comparison was to show two extremes with respect to prophelicity under the aspects of individualism and collectivism. Well, the main point we wanted to make was that the internalization of certain rating mechanisms, or let's say the application in everyone's daily life, is basically as advanced in the West as it is in China. There may be strong political differences in these different systems, but our topic is identity. And I do think that the form of internalization of certain profile building mechanisms through rating and ranking technologies is basically the same. And these political differences do matter, but they do not produce highly different forms of internalization. there is also a subtext here, because there is a certain kind of Western arrogance towards Chinese people, that they are somehow brainless or brainwashed, at least if compared to Westerners, right? It was highlighted, yes, Westerners can and do opt out, but the Chinese are kind of subjecting themselves, particularly if they actually embrace the system, to this more or less sheepishly. Now, I do not agree that there is a substantial difference here. I think in the West too, everyday life now is thoroughly rated and ranked, which is the major form of profile identity building. For instance, as a student, you can no longer go to a university without the university being ranked and without this having an effect on your academic profile. The same thing is basically true in all other areas of life. You cannot be an Uber driver without being constantly rated and ranked. As a YouTuber, I cannot opt out of profilicity. It is not an option to opt out of rating and ranking in today's society, no matter if you live in China or if you live in the West. Yes, there may well be huge political differences, but the degree of internalization and application, and what it means for one's identity shaping, what it means for the technology by which you build an identity, is practically the same. We evaluate ourselves and others on the basis of profiles, and we do so basically in all social areas today. Westerners in particular still tend to tell themselves the stories that, well, despite all of this, we are still underneath authentic individuals. And I think there's something wrong with this story. And that was the purpose of that section in the book. There were also a few questions about technology and profilicity. Finite Automata says, how would you view the internet as a medium in comparison to when other forms of communication changed society? Specifically thinking of the development and wide use of maps, timekeeping, books, and radio TV. And Guy Jehu says, to what extent do you believe that technology has been the driving factor in the rise of profilicity? Well, I would say basically the new technologies obviously enhance the shift from authenticity to profilicity greatly. However, we do think profilicity already predates the new media and predates social media. Maybe we can even say the way in which particularly social media flourish is due to the spread and the proliferation of profilicity rather than the other way around. These new technologies and new media are so successful precisely because they are so good at enhancing profilicity. That's why society embraces them so much. They are so much better, for instance, at producing second-order observation than, for instance, books or radio or TV, the older media, where feedback mechanisms were much more complicated and hardly existed. So active profile building is strongly facilitated by new media, new technologies. But we may say that probably to reverse what Guy Jehu said, it is not only the case that technology has been the driving factor in the rise of profilicity, but maybe even more so, profilicity has been the driving factor in the rise of new technologies. There were a lot of questions about second-order observation. Foka, for instance, writes, I don't understand how second-order observation is supposed to be something intrinsically modern. Getting information and whatever through a different medium person and not directly from a source doesn't seem explicitly modern to me. Well, yes, second-order observation always existed, but now it has become all-pervasive, it has become institutionalized. And again, It is especially visible in ratings and rankings, which is a very new phenomenon. Rating agencies in the finance industry are relatively new, and their influence in financing and in the economy in general is also something that is relatively recent. University rankings are just a few decades old. Poll orientation in politics is also something that, well, it already existed, but it didn't exist in the pre-modern world. Now, branding and marketing is also not that old. For many, many centuries, there were no brands, right? What was marketed were products. But now, brands are marketed, so that's second-order observation marketing. Or look at modern tourism, right? That's different from older ways of traveling, whatever, pilgrimage, which is obviously sincerity, religious role related. So nowadays you make a trip in order to post the pictures of it on your social media account. So these are forms of institutionalizing, particularly through rating and raging mechanisms, that are all relatively recent. We can say basically that a reversal of the primacy of the orientation and observation has taken place. Just think of the theme park photo we showed, right? In 2010, most people were still observing a show in the mode of first-order observation. That doesn't mean second-order observation didn't exist at the time, but it wasn't so regularly, so overwhelmingly applied as the photo of 2017 shows it is now. Milan Urošević writes, in accordance with the idea of second-order observation, wouldn't it be more accurate to say that in the paradigm of prophylicity, the divide between outside and inside is negated, since the outside consists of others' observations and the subject builds his/her identity by making themselves into an object to be observed in a certain way? Well, a good point, but let's not forget the insight must still be invested in the profile. Otherwise, the profile may not only be considered a fraud, but the subject will also find it difficult to identify with it, to embrace it, to emotionally commit to it, to affirm one's profile. So the inside is still an inevitable part of the prophilic persona. Then Funkeloid writes, looking at the photos of 2010 versus 2017, the people without cell phones seem way happier. Wouldn't you say that they are closer to wandering at ease? Well, yes, probably. They certainly seem and are way happier. They're not that self-concerned and they're more self-forgetting. However, our point was to highlight something different, not so much the relative unhappiness or inauthenticity of the 2017 audience, but the complexity of their observation, right? We don't really know if the people in 2017 are actually unhappy. They're not happy, but that's different from unhappy. But at the same time, they seem to be much more focused, much more absorbed in the second-order observation procedure. So second-order observation is something much more complex than a mere first-order observation. It's, if you want, not that simplistic, because you look at something as it is being observed. And that makes somehow reality more complex. ZM writes, do second-order observations diminish the original viewer's experience? In a theme park specter image from 2017, the phones seemingly dilute their facial expressions as explained. When experiencing an event as a second-order observation, the validation of lived experience is external, not internal, for others rather than ourselves. Yes, but again, I'm hesitant to say that the experience is diminished. Yes, it may be less enjoyable, less easygoing, but it's also, as I mentioned, more complex, and we can even say more critical. Amber S. again writes, I've understood second-order observation to describe an impersonal, disconnected form of second-hand information. So maybe, for example, anonymous likes on Facebook as opposed to comments from individuals. Yes, this is also true. I mean, again, in second order observation, we are concerned with the general peer, people we do not know. And the general peer, again, is today often more important, more reliable in some way, more objective than the present actual peer. SCLH writes, video essays, reviews, analysis, and commentary about media has gotten so popular on YouTube that it's safe to assume that viewers don't necessarily engage with the content that is being discussed, but rather stick to the second-hand viewing. A cluster of creators that feature content related to left-leaning politics has been labeled LeftTube. And within this community, there's an ongoing debate about who is and who isn't a LeftTuber. Every debate about this topic tends to land on the creator being discussed, with the viewers almost demanding a disclosure about whether or not this creator identifies as a LeftTuber or not, and whether they're willing to commit to that kind of content. Thanks a lot for this comment. This seems to explain very well the hostile reaction by one YouTube influencer, Tom Nichols, and his fan base on Twitter to our videos. Some viewers mentioned that. There was, just as this viewer describes here in his analysis of LeftTube, or her analysis, there was little engagement in content. A lot of it was actually some form of bullying. And many people just, ridiculed our thumbnail or font. But given this viewer's explanation, this makes a lot of sense to me now. It was basically, this bullying was an exercise in profiling of oneself and others. And unfortunately, that seems to be a central element of wokeism, again, similar to certain religious identification. So influences like this Tom Nichols seem to be something like televangelists of wokeism, who establish large congregations, and then this finding out who is, so to speak, in-group and who is out-group becomes like really a very, very essential element of this form of communication. So again, the point is here not to directly engage with content, but the point is to basically establish brands, establish labels, establish profiles of oneself and of others. SCLH then continued by saying, understanding a piece of media analysis as a product of genuine pretending coming from the creator allows the viewer to engage more critically with the ideas contained in the piece, because the affiliation of both the creator and the viewer are no longer the most relevant part of the discussion. Very good, thank you very much. And that's exactly the point, that through genuine pretending, we can somehow establish some distance from this obsession with identity, and thereby develop a more critical perspective both towards the content and towards the identity of oneself and others. So this brings us to the topic of genuine pretending. One viewer, JH, just asked very generally about genuine pretending. So genuine pretending is basically the paradoxical existential condition that we are facing, namely that genuineness is, so to speak, a result of a pretense, the result of a certain role enactment and sincerity, the result of the pursuit of originality and authenticity, or the result of profile creation and profilicity. So genuineness is the product of a performance. Stephen Bird says, how does one avoid an addiction to identity? The second-order observation of oneself through the lens of an iPhone camera sparks heavy emotions, disgust, pride, embarrassment. Does this signify an overly developed and obsessive relationship with one's identity? Well, I guess once we realize that genuineness is performed, is pretended, we can somehow distance us somewhat from our identity, and this can lead to more relaxation, to less obsession. Duzara 217 says, is it possible to opt out of profilicity and try to maintain an authentic expression of self, or at the very least minimize the impact that our online profiles have on our identities? Well, again, authenticity is not more true than profilicity. The point is really not to become truly authentic. This can become just as obsessive as profilicity, but generally to be less identity obsessed. Now, Jack Ryan says, can we know ourselves in meaningful ways other than through identity, which seems to necessarily involve knowing ourselves in relationship to others? Well, we need to build an identity, but maybe we can accept the pretense element, the performance element, the contingent part in it, both in ourselves and in others. And this then helps to be more at ease, more tolerant, also with others, also in relationships. Block writes, how do you reconcile the concept of identity with the Buddhist idea of the non-self, selflessness, and Sam Harris' concept of the illusion of the self? Well, we, Paul and I, derive the idea of genuine pretending from Taoism, which is very similar to both Buddhism and Sam Harris' ideas regarding the illusion of the self. So yes, there is an indirect connection here. Then there were some remarks about what you could call life in prophelicity. Tony Rigatoni, for instance, says, what are some of the consequences of playing out our relationships with other people via profiles? For example, what sort of impact does online dating have on romance? What sort of impact does Indeed have on applying for a job? And Ezekiel Callas writes, I'd love to hear talk more about the multiplicity of prophelicity, the differing and often contradictory identities we put forward on the various profiles we create, and if that has perhaps contributed to the reduced emphasis on authenticity. And Lucy Thompson says, paraphrasing here, real love and music can only be sincere or authentically experienced, not really in the mode of prophelicity. Well, in an earlier video, I talked about the work of a colleague in sociology, David Stark, who was analyzing electronic music performers who use a lot of aliases. So today we already have, for instance, in electronic music, a lot of artists who basically operate in the mode of prophelicity. So they intentionally use and create multiple profiles in order to enhance, let's say, the spectrum of the music that they can play. This is representative, I think, of prophelicity in general. It just allows for much more multiplicity, and that is necessary today. We need, so to speak, to be ready for multiple jobs, because most people do not simply have one job during their lifetime. Many people have 2 or 3 jobs at the same time. Many of the electronic musicians have some complete different profession during daytime. So similarly, we also now have multiple personal relationships. Most people are not just having one romantic partner for their whole life. And again, like in art, we have multiple music experiences, often for the same artist. So in this sense, prophelicity really reflects the demands of a highly dynamic, let's say, postmodern society. And prophelicity, therefore, is an identity technology that fits this multiplicity, which is needed in all these areas, from professional life to intimate life. And again, I'm not defending prophelicity here, but I'm also hesitant to condemn it from the perspective of authenticity. In fact, it may be the most advanced identity technology that is available to us today. Thanks again for all the questions that came in, and I apologize for those which I didn't address. Generally, for me, this was a good learning experience. It's very good to get both the encouraging but also the critical feedback, and I hope that this kind of dynamic feedback process can continue. Thanks again.